How's it going, everybody? Rival Indigo here, talking Star Trek again, and once again, the source is going to be Screen Rant. However, this time it's going to be a little bit different. I actually agree with this writer, John Orculia? I don't know how you say that word, or that name, but anyways, my last two videos talking Star Trek and referencing Screen Rant were in disagreement. One was definitely, I felt like the person was a Star Trek fan, they seemed well informed, but they just had a very strange perspective regarding the production of Star Trek 4, and then for some reason talking Star Trek 5. Anyways, today we're talking about Klingons, and this seems, rather apt because Klingons are pretty much the perpetual, baddie at some point or another in Star Trek. They've been portrayed in multiple different ways now, between Star Trek the original series, the films, the Next Generation, and even in the later films, the last set of films for the Abrams verse, the Klingons were shown kind of at a mid-stage evolution there, to use a term from Pokemon. Basically, in Star Trek the original series, you had Klingons that really didn't look any different from humans. They just wore a different costume and talked a little strange, I guess. They didn't even have pointy ears like the Vulcans or Romulans to set them apart. So it kind of made sense that if you were, going to do a big screen version, with a bigger budget and everything, you don't want them to just look like silly versions of humans. The original, there's a big difference between Star Trek the original series and the original series films when it comes to the size of the production, the effects, and the budgets and all that sort of thing. Of course, these are big screen films. They're projects that you can't have look like a 60s, low budget. Well, I don't know how low budget it really was, but by today's standards, low budget TV series. Anyways, so by that time in Star Trek the Motion Picture, and then The Search for Spock and beyond, especially The Undiscovered Country, they were featured very heavily there. You see Klingons that now are large, muscular. They have these like dreads or long hair, usually braided or something, and then they have these nose ridges and forehead ridges, like that set them apart and make them look more aggressive, and obviously like they could just headbutt things. So it was obviously something different, and everybody just kind of rolled with it. It was like, oh, these are Klingons. Obviously this old TV show, they couldn't quite do something, with the alien of the week and make them special and different, right? It was a TV budget. And that was basically how they were portrayed again for the next 20 plus years with Star Trek The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, and then Star Trek Enterprise. The thing is Star Trek Deep Space Nine actually has an episode where the crew of the Defiant, or Deep Space Nine, ends up stuck in the past with Worf with them, famous Worf of Star Trek Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, Klingon character. And obviously, when you've got the modern Klingon contrasted with the original series Klingon, it's like, what's going on here? So somebody actually asks Worf about it. He basically says it's something we don't discuss with outsiders. So kind of a funny moment there that it doesn't explain what happened, but it also kind of gives, I want to use a term that just popped into my head, like shadow lore. Like there's a gap in the lore, but something is implied. And in this case, Worf implies that something happened, that there was something going on that created this difference between him as a modern Klingon and them as past Klingons, and they just don't talk about it. Well, the reason we just don't talk about it is because there was no explanation at the time. It was literally just an on-screen change, and I don't think they really wanted to spend the time or energy to try and explain it. Star Trek Enterprise in Season 4, which, great show, and Season 4 absolutely fantastic. I can only imagine what a 5th season would have looked like for that show. But Season 4 actually explores the origins of the TOS Klingons, because in Enterprise, again, we see Klingons that look like Worf's version of Klingons, and this is before the original series. So, what happened? How do these Klingons that came before TOS look like this, and then they look like that again later? Well, it turns out that they were experimenting with genetic mutation, or augmentation. You had these augments that were kind of a precursor to Khan and company, and that same genetic technology was essentially used on the Klingons. Only on the Klingons it had more of a, I don't want to say pacifying effect, but basically it altered their physical characteristics. So instead of having these pronounced forehead ridges and big powerful Klingons and all this stuff, they were like tamed down. And over generations, they began to lose those features and looked more and more just like regular humans. And that would explain the original series Klingons. And then, of course, if more generations passed, perhaps there was a therapy or something going on to bring back their original genetic structure, or maybe it wore off, because it was used as a bioweapon, essentially. Maybe it wore off over time. And then, of course, that's where you would see several generations later, the original features of Klingons return to them. So that was basically what was explained with Enterprise. Enterprise explained, hey, they normally look like this. This bioweapon, this genetic augmentation weapon was used, and it changed them to look like what you see in the original series. And then apparently over time, they kind of went back to normal. The Abrams-verse films, Star Trek Into Darkness, and Star Trek Beyond. But in Star Trek Into Darkness, they actually feature the Klingons. And it's kind of interesting because in the timeline, of course, this is happening about the time of the original series, or maybe somewhat before it. But they show the Klingons, and the Klingons have some sort of, forehead ridges and those sorts of features, but you can definitely tell these characters, they have a different version of it. They're a little bit smoother looking, I suppose. So I feel like the Abrams verse was kind of giving that nod to Enterprise, which of course happened, in the Abrams timeline, but giving that nod to those events and showing, hey, here's the Klingons. They're still warriors. They still got all this going on, but there's definitely alterations happening. There's something changing in them. And then, of course, the other stuff would happen later. All right. So that is Star Trek's Klingons. All right. There you go. Now you know all the stuff that goes on and why they look different in the different shows. Here's the problem. And this is the Screen Rant article. It says, Star Trek is still dealing with Discovery's Klingon damage. How about that? Star Trek Discovery's Klingons were so poorly received, the bloodthirsty warrior race hasn't made a live-action appearance in a Star Trek show since. So, in Star Trek Discovery Season 2, they decided to feature the Klingons. And they made some really strange alterations to these characters. Like, they just don't look like Klingons at all. Like, I swear they were trying to just straight up make them look like animals of some sort. Like, just straight up barbarians. And it just didn't go over well. Nobody liked it. It was really bad looking. They ran this whole arc with them in it. And, they haven't been back. But, yeah, this article does explain that there have been redesigns. Star Trek Deep Space Nine joking about the way they look different between the original series and Next Generation. And then I think it does actually mention that Enterprise does some explaining there. But the problem is Discovery went off the deep end. And I'm glad that the writer over at Screen Rant was able to acknowledge this. In fact, even the last article I covered from Screen Rant acknowledged that Discovery is just not as popular as, for instance, Strange New Worlds. And there's a lot of reasons for that. However, so it brings up the fact that the Klingons have been missing from live action since Star Trek Discovery Season 2, which shows just how much damage the series' reimagined Klingons did to the bloodthirsty warrior race and their place in the franchise. The Klingons, in their most popular 24th century incarnation, still are a regular sight in Star Trek Lower Decks. Now, see, Star Trek Lower Decks and Season 3 takes place after the end of Star Trek Next Generation, after Deep Space Nine, after Nemesis, etc. And at that point in history, they're just Klingons. Nothing's changed with them. So it makes sense that Lower Decks would show them as they normally are. But in shows that follow the time frame of Discovery, like there's no explanation, first of all, for the changes to them. Like they don't even look like some sort of mid-step between the Klingons we know and the Klingons of the original series, right? They did this radical redesign because they wanted to use them to portray certain political groups, basically, is what they were meant to portray. And, unfortunately, those writing and producing the show make sure to point that out, therefore causing division in the fandoms. But since then, what have we gotten? Well, we got Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which takes place shortly after Discovery, so in the same time frame that those Klingons should still be around, and before the original series. And we have not gotten Klingons in Star Trek Strange New Worlds. Definitely not in Season 1, and there's been no indication that they're going to come around in Season 2. So, just to continue quoting the article, it says, as a 23rd century set prequel, Star Trek Discovery caused issues with canon, and the Klingons were one of the least popular aspects of the series. So I really do like the fact that they bring out that Discovery, basically just consistently caused issues with canon, and the Klingons were a pretty big part of that. And it says it's notable that Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which is set just a couple years after Star Trek Discovery Season 2, hasn't shown the Klingons. Granted, it's focused on introducing new aliens and planets to canon, but I mean, it's Star Trek. It's the Enterprise. Klingons are just part of that. So to have them, as it says here, persona non grata, it kind of is very strange. So it's possible we see them in Season 2, but I wonder, would Star Trek Strange New Worlds, with its proximity to the original series, decide, you know what? Discovery screwed up with the Klingons, right? The original series era is right around the corner from this show. Perhaps it's time to show the Klingons as we know them in the original series, because that is canon, and it's been explained multiple times now in canon. Between the implications in Deep Space Nine and the actual lore that was shown for that history, or that was in Star Trek Enterprise, we know that the look of the characters in the original series is canon, that they at some point do basically just look like humans in outfit. So wouldn't it be interesting if Star Trek Strange New Worlds, Season 2, or even if it wasn't until Season 3, whatever it is, at some point decides, okay, it's time to debut the original series Klingons. I think that would be pretty awesome. I think it's pretty stupid and silly that, as usual, something was kind of messed up by Discovery, and it does make you wonder if that's why we didn't get to see them in Strange New Worlds. Perhaps they are waiting for the appropriate time to show them again after this, and perhaps they're trying to figure out the appropriate way to show them. That's my vision there. Somewhere in Season 2 or potentially further down the road, if we get that, if we're fortunate, why not go, you know what? Let's do something interesting. Let's show the Klingons as they were in the original series, because we all know that was legitimate. So anyways, just kind of a first time for everything. I feel like Screen Rant tends to be a source of contention for me when it comes to opinions and viewpoints on Star Trek as a whole. I don't agree with most mainstream media outlets regarding the series and show in the modern world. But in this case, I agree that, basically Star Trek Discovery screwed up the Klingons, and they were so poorly received that we haven't seen them again. And will we see them again? So if you enjoyed the video or the commentary, go ahead and leave a like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and definitely subscribe for future content. This is Rival Indigo. See you next time.